Good morning. Oh, it's so nice to be back in Sacramento after a week in Seattle. Last week we attended the BCA National Ministers Meeting and National Council Meeting, and I was able to visit with Reverend Yukawa and Socho Gui, and they both said to say hello to the best talents in all of BCA. This morning, Patty is taking care of the Dharma School service in Placer, and Tim and Carol Sensei, Reverends Tim and Carol, I think they're taking care of Marysville today. But I know for all of us who went to the National Council meeting, it's so good to be home. And I'd like to thank Team Betsuin for taking care of the home front while we were gone, especially to Sensei Koichi for speaking while I was away in my absence. This past Thursday, I had an interesting experience. At the request of our own Suan Kashiwagi, I participated in a Rotary event at the Consumnes River College. I was representing Buddhism in a forum for peace. A forum for peace. I had something prepared to share, but after the keynote speaker, and there were 7 interesting panelists, and I followed a very unassuming Nisei woman, Mrs. Lorna Unno, who talked about the Japanese American experience of forced relocation into the concentration camps during World War II. Mrs. Unno, I introduced myself to her, and she said, I'm not Buddhist, I'm Presbyterian. I said, it's nice to meet you, and it's very nice. But she was so sweet in sharing her experience of going into the camps. She spoke without bitterness or anger about the experience, that she still wondered, what did we do to deserve that? In fact, that was a phrase that she quietly spoke more than a few times. She said, what did we do to deserve that? She explained that we were given very short notice and that we had to leave our homes with only what we could carry. We didn't have any suitcases, she said, so my father had to go out and buy some cheap cardboard suitcases for us to use. We didn't know where we were going, and so we didn't know what we should pack. Then she mentioned that while in camp, her father died. But she mentioned this almost as an aside to why she came to want to help at the camp hospital. She did not dwell for a moment on that difficult loss that her family had to endure. And like almost all of our Issei, Nisei, and Kibei generations, they shared the positive aspects of that hardship. She said, I learned to sew, and I knitted sweaters for the GIs. When she was done, I knew that whatever I had prepared, I needed to put aside. I was truly moved by her unassuming kindness and her attitude of quiet dignity that we have often felt from our Issei, Nisei, and Kibei generations. In the late 1960s, I was a student at UC Berkeley. It was an interesting time and place to be young here in America. One of the many issues that we were involved in trying to implement was what we called ethnic studies. Conservatives labeled students advocating change as radicals. Moderates might have said that we were student activists. But the truth is, we were just kids. And like all kids, we were influenced by the times in which we lived. Coming of age in the 1960s, we were infused with an awareness and a sensitivity that came from a tumultuous decade of people fighting for civil liberties. We were kids, outwardly questioning a war being waged in Vietnam and inwardly searching for our own personal identity. As I said, it was an interesting time, and I share this with you to give you a backdrop on a lesson that I was given, a lesson that I found myself sharing at this Forum for Peace this past Thursday. At that time, around 1968, a group of us students, we volunteered every Wednesday to go to the Hamilton Senior Citizens Program. This was a park facility just outside of San Francisco's Japantown. And back then, this senior program was comprised entirely of Issei. Almost all were women. During our Wednesdays together, I would often speak with some of the Issei Bachans, our first generation grandmothers, and I would ask them about the camps. And at that time, for our Nisei and Kibei generations, the second and the Kibei generations, they never ever talked about that experience. This was back in the 60s. When my persistence finally wore down some of the Bachans to remember this camp experience in their lives, to my dismay, they always also talked about the fun things that went on, the positive things. And they would say things like, oh, there were baseball games and sumo, and we learned to knit and sew. These were the last things I expected to hear. At that time, I was, as many young students of that time, quietly seething with a growing anger at the many injustices that were perpetuated everywhere, past and present. I wanted to hear our Bachans telling me of their suffering and their resentment. I wanted to become their advocate and become angry and indignant for them because they would not. One afternoon while I was there, again persisting with my inquiries, a wonderful Bachan, my adopted grandmother, Mrs. Kyo Hirano, who was at that time in her early 70s, she pulled me aside and she said to me in Japanese, "Sono camp no hanashi o mo yamenasai." I want you to stop talking about the camps. And then she said, "Mochiron tsurakatta." Of course it was hard. But she said, "Sore wa anata no kuro denai." That is not your suffering. That's not your pain. She said, that's ours. And then she told me, don't pick it up. Don't pick it up. And then she said, if I pick it up, I will poison my life. She used the word poison. If I pick up that anger and that pain, I will poison my life. We who are a part of the generations that have followed, we have been given a wonderful gift. A gift from all those who endured the humiliation and injustice, the kuro, the pain and suffering that we euphemistically refer to as the camp. That gift was this: to live without anger or hate for things that were done to those we love. The generations before gave us the gift of no anger. This is huge. This is huge. For this gift of no anger is the path to peace. The gift of no anger is the path to peace. There can be no peace in the world. There can be no peace in our own minds and hearts if we carry anger within us. And anger, as you know, is one of the three poisons that blind us from seeing things as they are. I have long considered myself an advocate for peace. I am, after all, a child of the 60s. But when we are shocked by the horrific examples of humankind's inhumanity, at that moment I find myself feeling helpless and wondering, is world peace really an impossible dream? Is it an unworthy hope for us to wish for? At such times, I find myself reminded of the saying by a wonderful Dharma teacher within our tradition, Reverend Gyomei Kubose. He wrote the well-known books Everyday Suchness and Center Within. Reverend Kubose, in the book Center Within, wrote a short chapter entitled World Peace Begins with Gassho. World peace begins with gassho. World peace begins with my own peace of mind, with my nurturing a sense of gratitude. Many of you have heard me mention this before, for I've quietly carried Reverend Kobose's words with me for decades. To say that world peace begins with gassho is to say that world peace begins with me. It does not start out there. It is not the responsibility of others. It is my responsibility. It starts with me. When we find ourselves wondering and worrying about the uncertain future that's in front of us, let us try to keep this image and this feeling in our hearts and in our minds. World peace does begin with gassho. It begins with me. Healing the wounds of hate begin with me. Hope for the future of humanity begins with our peaceful gassho. Even within families, there are times when we have differences of opinion, perhaps even arguments. How much more difficult and dangerous it is when conflicts are felt at a global level. But whether it is the hope for harmony within our home, the hope for harmony within our sangha, or the hope for world peace, let us always keep in mind that it starts with each of us. It starts with me. World peace does begin with gassho. It begins with each of us nurturing peace of mind and no anger within us. So I hope you'll take this reflection with you today. When I spoke at the Forum for Peace on Thursday, I found myself sharing this message again that Hirano-san gave to me so many decades ago. In closing, please join me in gassho. From the generations before, we have been given an amazing gift. They gave us the gift of no anger. The gift of no anger is the path to peace. There can be no peace in the world, and there can be no peace within ourselves if we carry anger and resentment within us. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida.